Welcome back to the Junk Room. It's me, the Junkman, and I'm coming back at you with another video. And today we're going to talk about vintage toys. What is a vintage toy? This is something that comes up a lot. You're on the eBay at 3 o'clock in the morning. You're wanting to find some Star Wars toys. So you type Kenner vintage Star Wars toys and it brings up 90s toys and you get all mad. And you go on social media to complain about it. And someone, without a doubt, tells you, hey, the 90s was over 25 years ago. The 90s is now vintage toys. Star Wars vintage toys also include the 90s. That's what I call a cup of BS. So what is vintage? Well, yes. In the broadest term of the word, anything older than 25 would fall into that category as vintage. But you have to look at that word in a collector's market. And as you can see, there's different terms for that word throughout a collector's community. When someone in the collector community or toy community says vintage, they're not talking about the broadest term of the word. They're talking about the word within that collector's group. So let's break down and look at some of these other collectors groups. Let's start with people that collect cars. For people that collect vintage cars are between 1919 and 1930. A little small gap there for sure. Now, if you got a car from 1995, that's not a vintage car, sorry. And they also have a category in the collector's market of cars called antiques that are 1931 to about 1975. You probably can play with these numbers a little bit, but from the research I found, that's the number most people go on. And anything made before the year 2000 is considered a classic. So again, if you got a car in 1998, that's not a vintage or even an antique. Now this market's a little different because you'll see in these other collectors world, antique usually is the oldest stuff with vintage being somewhere in the middle. That's not the case here. When it comes to car, vintage is the oldest, 1919 to 1930, with antiques being in the middle, 1931 to 1975, and anything before the year 2000 is considered classic. I guess I'm not. I was gonna make a joke that I'm classic, but I was born in that antique. Oh man, that sounds. I'm antique. I'd rather be called vintage, I think. Now let's talk about vintage clothing. I know you look at the Junkman, you think this guy knows fashion, and that I do. So when it comes to clothes, the word vintage has a meaning there, meaning anything older than 25 years and going back as far as 100 years. If it's past 100 years, I don't know. I don't know if they call that antique clothes or just call that, I don't know what they call that, but anything between 100 years and 25 years ago does fall under vintage. But that's the clothing when we're talking toys. So let's look at another category that's more in the realm of action figures. Let's look at train model collectors. Now that's close to the toy market, and let's see, what is their vintage years? Well, their vintage years is 1945 to 1969, and believe it or not, 1970 to present day is considered modern. That's right, if you have a model train from 1976, other than that being very cool, that's a modern toy considered in the train market collectors community. Now before we look at the action figure market, let's look at one more. Let's talk about furniture. Yep, there's antique furniture, vintage furniture, and modern furniture. So what is vintage furniture? Well, 1950 to 1989 is considered vintage furniture. I might have some of that in my living room and didn't even know it. And anything before 1950 is considered antique. Anything after 1989 is considered modern. So at least I can say I do have some modern stuff also. Now, we've looked at all those categories. Let's talk about the one you're here for, the action figure category. For the action figure collector market, there's three categories: antique, vintage, and modern. Let's look at antique. What years is antique? Well, pre-1965. I guess you could say, in the year 1700, that stuff's not antique, that stuff's ancient. But, within 100 years between that and 1965 is considered antique toys. So you got that out of the way. What about vintage? That's what we got us here anyway. People saying 90s is vintage. Is 90s vintage toys? Well, again, we're talking the term in the collector's market. And in the collector market, when you hear a toy collector talk about vintage, unless there's some hipster edgelord on 4chan, they're talking about 1965 to 1989. That's considered the vintage years of toys. Hate that. Hate when I do that. 1989 until present day is actually considered modern toys. Now, sometimes, very rarely, I don't see it talked about a lot, you might have a subcategory in that modern category as neo. Neo meaning new. Neo, you might see it known as a Neo collection. I've seen that term used. But that just means mostly 90s toys, if anyone's using the term Neo. Again, I don't hear that term used very much, but I thought I'd throw that in there. So let's look at the categories again. You got somewhere starting around the year 1900, I'm not really sure what toys started, all the way to 1965. That's considered antique toys. And I guess you could come up with some sub-genres in between there, but for the most part, antiques is that range. Vintage toys would be 1966 all the way to 1989, with modern day falling in 1990 to present day. But what about the term retro? You see that thrown around a lot nowadays. Retro. What is retro? I think most of you know what retro is, but I'll bring it up anyway for this video. Retro is anything that's made at current day to look old. If something's made, around this time, in the last 5 years to look like it was made in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, maybe even the 90s, that would be considered retro. It's not really anything that fits into an antique, vintage, or modern. Well, I guess if it's in a modern technically, but you know what I mean. It don't fit into, it's not vintage, it's not antique, but it's made to look like it should fit into those categories. That would be considered retro. But I hope that explains some of the categories when it comes to toy collecting, and why the Star Wars toys of the 90s or your Spider-Man toys of the 90s are not vintage. Now, I know making this video is not going to change any of those people's mind. You're still going to get on your social media and someone's going to tell you that the Star Wars 90 toys are vintage, because there's always that person that has to tell you. That uses the broadest term of the word just so they can try to look smart in a Facebook post or something. But anyway, again, vintage is not 90s. Sorry. I know you millennials hope it was, but it's not. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think about this. Do you call the 90s vintage? If you do, please stop. I want to thank you for watching. As always, thumbs up and like my content. Subscribe to the channel. We'll talk again soon.
Hey, Junkman channel popping though.
Thank you, sir, for that unsolicited testimony.